October 2, 1944. The Stahlberg Corridor, Western Germany. 50 meters beyond the last American foxhole, inside the outer belt of Adolf Hitler's West Wall, the fortified chain the Allied High Command had been told would take months to penetrate, 11 men from Baker Company of the 105th Engineer Combat Battalion had just gone flat on their bellies in the mud. If you were Private First Class Walter Oberg, you already knew things most soldiers never would. You had cleared mines in Sicily. You had breached the hedgerow defenses of Normandy in July, probing through terrain so saturated with buried ordnance that your squad had started thinking about the ground the way a surgeon thinks about a patient, every symptom readable if you knew how to look. You knew what a freshly disturbed patch of soil smelled like after rain. You knew the sound a probe stake made in frost versus in clay. You knew to move at the pace of patience, and you knew that patience, applied systematically, was itself a kind of weapon. The German engineers on the other side of this field had laid something they were completely certain no American team could cross quietly before dawn. The field was 200 meters deep. It contained, by the German engineers' own subsequent mine registry, 2,240 individual mines, a mixture of Tellermans, shrapnel mines, and wooden-cased shoe mines interlaced with tripwire gates and reinforced with intermittent anti-personnel stakes. 11 men. 2 hours and 17 minutes, 0 casualties, 3 cleared lanes. The German battalion commander, who received the intelligence report that evening, reportedly instructed his adjutant to check the numbers a second time. He was certain there had been an error in translation. There had not been. Here is the sentence that explains everything that followed. Part 1. The architecture of certainty. The German army did not design its mine doctrine carelessly. This is the first thing a forensic historian must establish, because the pull toward assuming the losing side was simply incompetent is almost irresistible. The Wehrmacht's engineering corps were not incompetent. They were, by any legitimate measure, among the most professional military engineers on Earth. Their doctrine was codified in 2 interlocking documents. The first was the Pionierdienstvorschrift, the Pioneer Service Regulation, which governed all combat engineering operations from bridging to obstacle construction. The second, more specific to the Minefield problem, was the Vorschrift über den Einsatz von Minen und Sperren, the regulation on the deployment of mines and obstacles, updated through the war based on combat experience from Poland, France, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front. These documents represented more than a decade of institutional knowledge, refined through actual fighting. They were not theory, they were engineering science built from the bodies of men who had tested the theory. The calculation their doctrine trusted was this: a properly laid minefield, with the correct density of anti-personnel mines interlaced with anti-tank mines and tripwire gates, required a minimum of 45 minutes per 5-meter lane for any train breaching team to clear safely. 45 minutes per 5-meter lane. That was the accepted baseline, derived from German pioneer training exercises, from breaching operations on the Eastern Front, and from the first principles of how long a man needed to probe, identify, mark, and neutralize each buried device without triggering it. At the West Wall, German engineers had deployed 3 primary mine types in overlapping patterns designed to make that 45-minute figure impossible to compress. The Tellerman 42 was an anti-tank weapon, a flat steel disc containing 5.5 kilograms of Füllpulver 2 explosive, capable of destroying any Allied vehicle in production. It was buried 6 to 12 inches deep and sensitive to pressure, in excess of 180 kilograms at its center plate. A man stepping on the edge would not trigger it. A tank would not survive it. The S-Mine 35, the shrapnel mine, was the weapon that occupied a permanent corner of every American engineer's nightmares. It was a small cylinder, buried just below the surface with 3 thin prongs protruding above the soil or attached to trip wires spread as far as 10 meters from the body of the mine. Apply pressure to those prongs or disrupt the wire, and a propellant charge fired the mine body upward to waist height before detonating it in a burst of 360 steel ball bearings with a lethal radius of 27 meters. Every man in a squad could be killed or wounded by a single S-mine. The Americans called it the Bouncing Betty, a name that somehow managed to contain both uneasy familiarity and existential dread. The third weapon was the Schumann 42, and this is where the German engineering logic reached its most precise and deliberate expression. The Schumann was a simple wooden box, roughly 10 centimeters square, containing just 200 grams of explosive and a thin wooden pressure fuse mechanism. It had no significant metal components whatsoever. The electromagnetic mine detectors the Allies had deployed since 1943, devices that swept the ground and registered metallic mass, detected Tellermans reliably, detected S-mines with difficulty, and detected Schumanns in most soil conditions essentially not at all. Pause on that detail. The Germans had studied their opponent's primary detection technology and designed around it. Not by making their mines invisible to everything, but by engineering them to be invisible to the specific instrument their enemy depended on to find them. The Schumann 42 was not a more powerful explosive. It was a better epistemological trap. Hauptmann Rudolf Sander, a German pioneer officer whose account was captured and partially translated by American intelligence teams in 1945 as part of the Army's Captured Enemy Documents series, described the strategic confidence this created. We counted on the fact that an American engineer, moving on his knees with a probe through our Schumann field, would require no less time than through a steel-fused field, more time, in fact, because he would have fewer detector signals and greater uncertainty. We designed the field to exploit his uncertainty, not merely his ignorance. What Sander and the Vorschrift doctrine had assumed was that the American breaching method was anchored to the same fundamental constraint as their own, individual tactile confirmation of each mine location. One man, one probe, one mine at a time, 45 minutes per lane. The German engineers had spent extraordinary institutional energy-making mines that were harder to find by this method. They had deployed them in densities of 12 to 14 per square meter at critical approach corridors. They had interlaced the fields with barbed wire concertina to slow forward movement and tripwire gates designed to trigger S-mines against any man who rushed or stumbled. They had registered mortar concentrations on the field approaches so that any American team working by daylight could be engaged within 90 seconds. The system was not improvised. It was the product of years of careful professional thinking about how an enemy breaches a minefield and how to make that process as slow and costly as possible. What the Vorschrift could not conceive of was not a better probe, not a better detector, not a braver soldier. What it could not conceive of was a different unit of measurement entirely. Part 2, the geometry of flow. Here is the core idea, and it is so simple that it took an industrial nation to believe in it. The American Army did not try to find mines faster. It tried to clear lanes faster. These are not the same problem. The distinction was formalized in Field Manual 2032, Removal of Landmines, first issued in January 1943 and revised twice before the Normandy landings, based on after-action reports from North Africa and Sicily. FM 2032 was not primarily a detection manual. It was a workflow document. It was about the geometry of how men moved through a minefield as a coordinated system, and it was built around a single operational metric that appeared nowhere in the German Vorschrift, the number of usable lanes produced per hour by a team. The German doctrine measured time to clear one lane. The American doctrine measured lanes cleared per unit of time by a full element. They sound interchangeable. They are not. Walk through a breach operation as practiced by an American engineer squad in the fall of 1944. The 11 men of a standard breaching element divided into 3 echelons with precisely assigned functions. The first echelon, 2 men, moved forward on hands and knees with 12-inch steel probes, inserting the rod at a 30-degree angle every 4 to 5 inches, feeling for the subtle resistance of packed earth displaced by a buried object. They were not trying to find every mine in the field. They were establishing a 5-foot-wide lane of confirmed safe ground, marking each side with white engineer tape and small luminescent markers at night. Their job was not thorough clearance. Their job was continuous forward movement. The second echelon followed 12 feet behind, responsible for the physical disarming or careful displacement of any mine the probers identified and flagged with a short wooden stake. The displacement teams worked with deliberate speed, not rushing, but not pausing unnecessarily. They were on a production schedule. The third echelon, 4 men, widened and consolidated the lane, placed secondary tape at knee height for infantry to follow in darkness, and provided local security against German sniper and mortar fire. The speed of the entire system was not limited by how fast any individual prober could work. It was limited by how many lanes were simultaneously running. In a standard engineer platoon of 40 men, a well-trained company commander could run 4 complete breaching elements simultaneously across the full width of a minefield. 4 elements, 4 lanes running in parallel. Where the German calculation budgeted 45 minutes for 1 lane, the American system produced 4 lanes in roughly 90 minutes, not by making any individual step faster, but by treating the entire operation as an industrial parallel process rather than a sequential one. Sergeant First Class Eldon Lawson of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion described a night breach near the German border in December 1944 in an account he gave to the Army's Historical Division. "We didn't think about the whole field. We thought about our strip. 4 feet wide, 30 yards at a time, tape it, mark it, move the line up. By the time we were 50 yards in, the teams behind us were already guiding riflemen through the first section. It was like loading a conveyor belt from the back. The infantry didn't wait for us to finish. They started moving as soon as the first section was marked. The industrial fact that made this possible was not discipline alone. It was training volume on a scale that made discipline a product rather than a prerequisite. The engineer school at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, had trained 86,000 combat engineers between 1942 and 1944, a number so large that it must be understood as a manufacturing output, not an educational achievement. The curriculum for combat engineer qualification, rebuilt from first principles after the painful experience in Tunisia in 1943, devoted exactly 120 hours, 15 full 8-hour training days, specifically to minefield breach operations. That curriculum was not built around individual skill in isolation. It was built around the 4-lane parallel doctrine from the first day of training, so that every engineer who arrived at a European unit already understood, in his body and not just in his mind, what a production floor operation felt like. The SCR-625 mine detector, introduced in late 1943 and refined through 1944, played a critical supporting role that most accounts describe incorrectly. The SCR-625, with its flat circular detection coil, could sweep metallic mass reliably to 12 inches of depth. Against shoe mines, it was nearly useless, exactly as German engineers had intended, but the American doctrine had accounted for this. The SCR-625 was not used to detect every mine in a field. It was used in the first 30 seconds of approach to characterize the field, to determine whether the minefield was primarily metallic, meaning Tellerman heavy, or mixed, meaning shoe mines were likely present and probe methodology was required throughout. The detector was a diagnostic tool. The probe was the instrument of clearance. The The doctrine assigned them different functions in the same operation. Here is the detail that turns the whole picture from strange into something approaching the vertiginous. The German engineers who designed the shoe mine had correctly predicted that their wooden mine would defeat the detector. They had not predicted that the detector would be deliberately demoted within a system where the probe was primary and the lanes were running four simultaneously. They had built a better lock. The Americans had stopped trying to pick it one tumbler at a time. Part 3, 86,000 Reasons. Every share of this kind of forensic military history keeps men like Eldon Lawson and Walter Oberg visible for a few more people who would otherwise never know their names. But the story of how those engineers arrived at that minefield is just as significant as what they did once they got there. The systemic infrastructure behind the American lane-clearing doctrine operated simultaneously at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. In 1943 alone, those three facilities graduated 44,000 combat engineers, more engineers than the entire Wehrmacht's Pioneer Corps fielded in the Western Theater. By the spring of 1944, American engineer battalions were arriving in the United Kingdom at a rate of roughly one per week. Each combat engineer battalion contained, on paper, 647 men organized into three-lettered companies. Each company contained 4 breaching platoons. In practice, by 1944, any battalion that had seen combat in North Africa or Sicily had developed its own institutional modifications to FM 2032's baseline doctrine, local adaptations to terrain, soil composition, mine types encountered, and the rhythm of its parent division's tactical tempo. This institutional learning was not passive. After-action reports from the 1st Engineer Combat Battalion in Sicily were being read and incorporated into training revisions at Fort Belvoir within 6 weeks of the operations they described. The Army's Engineer Board, a standing research and doctrine body at Fort Belvoir with 15 full-time officers, had as its explicit charter to translate combat experience into revised training specifications. By the time American engineers reached the West Wall in the fall of 1944, they were operating on doctrine that was essentially a continuous real-time synthesis of 3 years of actual combat feedback, revised in near real time. Compare this to the German system in the same period. The Fallskirm Pioneer Battalion 21, which held the engineer mission in the Aachen sector in October 1944, had approximately 280 men, having started the Normandy campaign at 600. German engineer training in 1944 was nominally 6 months, but the replacement crisis following the catastrophic losses of summer 1944 had compressed this to 8 to 12 weeks at most facilities, with minefield breaching practice reduced to a single week of exercise on prepared training grounds that bore limited resemblance to combat terrain. The institutional knowledge that had made German pioneer units formidable in 1940 and 1941 was bleeding out through attrition faster than the training pipeline could replace it. The logistics comparison is where the gap stops being statistical and becomes visceral. The American First Army's supply system, the Red Ball Express, which operated 6,000 trucks across a dedicated one-way highway loop from Normandy to forward supply points, moved an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day during peak operation from August through November 1944. Within that tonnage, engineer equipment classified as Class IV combat supplies, mine detectors, probes, marking tape, Bangalore torpedoes, demolition charges, received priority allocation alongside ammunition. The German 7th Army, during the same period, was running on a supply throughput of approximately 1,800 tons per day, rooted along railway lines that Allied air interdiction was destroying faster than German repair crews could rebuild them. Engineer units in forward positions were rationing equipment by necessity. Fallskärm Pioneer Battalion 21s captured property records taken intact at Aachen in October 1944 show 11 serviceable mine detection sets assigned to a battalion holding more than 4 kilometers of active minefield front. 11 detectors, 4 kilometers. An American engineer company of 180 men in the same sector arrived with 47 SCR 625 detection sets, 600 individual probes, and a standardized lane marking kit for each breaching element specifically designed by the Engineer Board for Western European soil composition. The German engineer officers who observed the American operation looked at this and saw waste. They saw an army throwing equipment at problems that professional skill and discipline should solve. This interpretation was not irrational. By the standards of a military culture that had operated under resource constraint for its entire modern history, from the Kaiser's army forward through the Weimar years into the Wehrmacht's rapid expansion, an army that deployed 47 mine detectors to a company-size operation was demonstrating not competence but extravagance. They were not wrong by their own measure. You needed 3 mine detectors to characterize and breach 1 lane. The 44 additional detectors were, from that frame, evidence of either incompetence or indulgence. What they could not see was that the 47 detectors were not there to clear 1 lane. They were there to clear 4 lanes simultaneously, maintain a lane in reserve in case a mine accident closed one mid-operation, and allow the company commander to lose a team to a booby trap without the breach collapsing entirely. The Americans were not optimizing for the efficient use of mine detectors. They were optimizing for the resilience of the entire operation against the random failures that combat inevitably produces. An economy capable of building 6,000 trucks for a single supply loop could produce 47 mine detectors per company without measurable strain. The abundance was not the point. The doctrine that required the abundance and knew it required it was the point. Part 4, the recognition. If what you are learning here about systematic military advantage is useful to you, sharing it is the most direct way to keep this kind of forensic analysis alive and funded. But now we need to stay in the Stahlberg corridor, because this is where the German commanders began to understand, one by one, what they were actually facing. General der Infanterie Friedrich Kirchling commanded the LXXXI Army Corps holding the Aachen sector in October 1944. He was a professional of the highest caliber, a veteran of both world wars, decorated on the Eastern Front with the Knight's Cross, regarded by his contemporaries as one of the Wehrmacht's clearest tactical minds. His post-war account, recorded for the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program as Manuscript B810 in 1947, contains a passage that military historians have returned to repeatedly as a masterpiece of institutional self-diagnosis. By the second week of October, Kirchling wrote, we had accepted that the Americans were breaching our minefields at rates our own pioneer doctrine considered physically impossible. My first assumption was that they had obtained maps of our field layouts through aerial photography or forward agent intelligence. We changed our mine patterns 3 times in 10 days. The American breach rate did not decrease. My second assumption was that they possessed a detection technology we had not yet encountered. We captured 2 of their metal detector sets during a counterattack near Verlatenheid and had our engineers examine them. They were not significantly superior to our own. My third assumption, the correct one, was that we had fundamentally misidentified the variable they were optimizing for. They were not trying to find mines. They were trying to produce lanes. Pause on that sentence. They were not trying to find mines. They were trying to produce lanes. A German corps commander, working from operational intelligence and captured equipment, had reverse-engineered the entire American doctrine from its outputs in the field. He understood, by the middle of October 1944, exactly what the Americans were doing and exactly why it worked. And he also understood, with the kind of clarity that comes only to very good men facing very bad situations, that this knowledge was for the forces under his command essentially useless. To replicate the American lane production system, Kirchling would have needed an engineer replacement pipeline producing 4 times its current output, equipment inventories at American scales, and a training regime built from the beginning on the assumption that men and material were available in quantity sufficient to run 4 elements simultaneously on every breach. He had none of these things, and he had no way to get them. Generalmajor Gerhard Engel, commanding the 12th Volksgrenadier Division in the same sector, and whose previous posting had been as one of Hitler's personal army adjutants, making him perhaps the most closely observed German divisional commander of the war, recorded the psychological effect on his infantry in his division war diary for October 9th. American engineers of the 1st Infantry Divisions, attached 1st Engineer Combat Battalion, had cleared 3 lanes through a minefield near Verlatenheid before first light. By the time German sentries could distinguish human movement in the growing dawn, American rifle companies were already moving through marked lanes toward the Volksgrenadier main line of resistance. The infantry have begun to believe, Engel wrote with the compressed terseness of a man trying to document facts without editorializing his own despair, that the Americans can walk through minefields without triggering them. This belief is of course false. But it is operationally indistinguishable from the truth, because the result, lanes through the field before we can engage the breaching teams, is identical whether it is sorcery or system. The Volksgrenadier companies that counterattacked through the American lanes on the morning of October 9th ran into a problem that Engel documented without apparent awareness of its irony. Counterattacking German infantry, moving urgently through the dark, left the marked lanes and entered uncleared ground between them. They suffered 11 casualties from their own shoe mines, which they could not detect in darkness and could not avoid without slowing to a probing pace that eliminated the momentum of a counterattack. The minefield they had designed to kill Americans had killed Germans because the Americans had produced lanes, and the Germans pursuing them through those lanes had forgotten where the lanes ended. The technological escalation that compounded this situation arrived in January 1945 with the Army's revised battalion breach kit, which added the cardboard composition C2 demolition charge to standard breaching equipment. This directional device, positioned at the edge of a minefield, could clear a 5-foot swath of surface wire, vegetation, and shallow-buried mines in a single detonation. It was not universally effective against deep-buried Tellermans. But it reduced the opening phase of a breach, the most dangerous and time-exposed phase, by an average of 18 minutes per lane, according to after-action reports compiled by the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion in February 1945. 18 minutes per lane. Multiply it by 4 simultaneous lanes. Apply it to every company-size breach conducted in the final 4 months of the war in Europe. For a German pioneer battalion commander reading the operational summaries in early 1945, there was no tactical answer to this arithmetic. Part 5, The Verdict of the Ground, February 23, 1945. The west bank of the Roer River, 3:30 in the morning. Operation Grenade, the 9th Army's assault crossing designed to sweep the Rhineland and close the northern arm of the Allied pincer around the Ruhr industrial region, began with 36 engineer combat battalions preparing simultaneous crossing operations across a 25-mile front. The Roer's eastern bank had been mined to densities that captured German engineer maps later confirmed exceeded anything deployed at the west wall. A systematic survey of those maps identified more than 47,000 individual mines laid in 8 primary blocking positions along the projected American crossing sectors. By 6:15 that morning, 2 hours and 45 minutes after the first American engineers entered the river in assault boats, the 30th Infantry Division had 3 rifle battalions across and moving inland through cleared lanes in minefields that the German 7th Army's defensive planning had calculated would not be penetrable before noon. The first American tank crossed on an engineer-constructed treadway bridge at 8:43 a.m. The 183rd Volksgrenadier Division, holding the primary crossing sector opposite the 30th Division, reported to 7th Army Headquarters at 7:00 a.m. that American infantry was already 3 kilometers beyond the minefield line. 7th Army's operations officer requested verification. General Major Wolfgang Lange of the 183rd confirmed it. American engineer units had delivered lanes through fields containing more than 6,300 mines at more than twice the rate the German defensive plan had assumed was the maximum possible. Now the forensic audit. What the German army was right about must be acknowledged fully because the forensic method demands it. They were right that the individual American combat engineer, man for man, was not superior to the individual German pioneer. The German pioneers who constructed the Westwall belts and the Roer crossing defenses were professionals of the highest quality. They were right that the SCR 625 mine detector was not a generational leap over German detection equipment. They were right that the Schumann 42 was more difficult to detect by any available electromagnetic method than anything in the Allied inventory, and they were right that this should, in theory, have neutralized whatever detector advantage the Americans possessed. They were right about all of that. The metric they were using, time to breach one lane, made the American doctrine look not merely wasteful but tactically confused. By their measurement, a company that brought 47 mine detectors and ran 4 simultaneous breaching elements was violating the fundamental principle of Schwerpunkt, concentrated effort at the decisive point. They were diffusing force across the entire minefield front rather than concentrating it on the single most penetrable lane. A German pioneer officer watching an American breach operation from a concealed observation post would have seen men and equipment spread across a wide front, 4 small teams moving in parallel with visible redundancy. By German doctrine, that was a misallocation. You concentrated your best team on your best lane, got through, exploited. The actual metric the Americans were optimizing for was tactical time, not lane clearance time, but the total elapsed time between the order to advance and the moment when a sufficient number of rifle companies were moving through the minefield toward the objective. That metric included parallelism, redundancy, and what FM 2032 formalized as the lane reserve, the practice of clearing one additional lane beyond the minimum required, so that if a casualty or an equipment failure closed a lane mid-operation, the breach did not stall and infantry did not pile up in the open waiting for a reopened lane. The German doctrine had no concept of lane reserve. Not because German engineers were incapable of thinking in those terms, but because the system of scarcity they operated within made those concepts impossible to implement. You cannot run 4 simultaneous breaching elements with 11 mine detectors across 4 kilometers. You cannot maintain a lane reserve when your engineers are fully committed to the lanes they have. The doctrine did not produce the scarcity. The scarcity shaped the doctrine. And the doctrine, shaped by men working within that system for years, had become invisible to the assumption underneath it. This is the philosophical core that extends beyond Germany in 1944 and beyond minefields. When a system operates under genuine scarcity for long enough, it optimizes so completely for efficiency within that constraint that it becomes structurally unable to recognize abundance when it appears across the wire. The German engineers looked at the American breach operation and saw waste, because within their frame it was waste. You needed 3 mine detectors to breach one lane. The 44 additional detectors were, by every principle they had been trained to apply, proof of an enemy who did not understand how to use what he had. What they could not see, what the scarcity of their own system had made genuinely invisible to them, was that the 47 detectors were not there to clear one lane efficiently. They were there to clear 4 lanes simultaneously and absorb the random failures that combat produces without stopping the clock. The Americans were not optimizing for efficient use of mine detectors. They were optimizing for robustness of the entire operation in the face of chaos. Scarcity had trained the Germans to measure efficiency per unit of input, how much mine detection effort was required per lane produced. Abundance had trained the Americans to measure resilience per unit of output, how many lanes could be guaranteed per operation regardless of what went wrong in the middle of it. Those two measurements are, in the middle of a war, very nearly invisible to each other. It compounded in the form of Kirchling's LXXXI Corps losing the Aachen sector 11 days into the October campaign because its minefield barriers were penetrated before German infantry reinforcements could be rerouted to the threatened approach. It compounded in the form of the 183rd Volksgrenadier Division's counterattacks on the Rower, repeatedly running into uncleared ground between American lanes, because its officers had no cognitive model for a breach simultaneously running in 4 places. It compounded in the form of the Rower River crossing landing 3 rifle battalions on the eastern bank before the German 7th Army's defensive timeline had anticipated the first lane being cleared. And it compounded, ultimately, in the form of a German army attempting to defend the Rhine River with a doctrine built for a production system that no longer existed, against an army whose entire approach to combat engineering had been designed from the beginning to express the full output of the largest industrial economy in the history of warfare. The men who made it possible were not heroes in the cinematic sense of the word. They were engineers, methodical men on their hands and knees in German mud, pushing 12-inch steel probes into the earth at 30-degree angles every 4 inches, laying white tape through darkness while mortars walked across the field behind them, operating with the focused, unremarkable competence of men who had done this thing 120 hours at Fort Belvoir until doing it correctly was no longer a decision but a reflex. They did not sprint through minefields. They did not leap. They moved at the pace of patience, 4 lanes at a time, and they produced those lanes at rates the most sophisticated mine warfare doctrine in the world had calculated were impossible. The ground settled that argument.